Hi, this is Brass Check, and it's our Brass Check commentary on the recent death of Fidel Castro, which is certainly in the news, and lots of conversations, lots of commentary about Castro. Some laud him as a hero, others as a demon. Neither opinion is terribly helpful. It would be good to have some facts. The facts of Cuba. Cuba was first taken by the Spanish. They had it for many hundreds of years, from the 1490s all the way through to the turn of the century, last century. They were vicious. They were cruel. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. It was a pretty nasty place to live. One of the things that made Cuba an even worse place to live was the sugar trade. And a fair amount of that sugar trade was financed by U.S. slave masters, especially after the Civil War with the abolition of slavery, which happened in the 1860s. Cuba still had slavery. In fact, Cuba was the last country to give up slavery in the Western Hemisphere. So a lot of Southern gentlemen, took their money and raced to Cuba to expand the sugar trade there. Sugar slavery is one of the most, certainly one of the most, if not the most vicious forms of slavery that ever existed. It was designed to get sugar planted, harvested, and milled, all of which are pretty miserable jobs when you're doing it all by hand. Also, the calculation made by the plantation owners, which included, again, a lot of Americans, was, it's cheaper to bring new guys over from Africa than to keep these guys alive. So they were literally worked to death. And then a new batch of people was brought in to pick up the slack. So this was a hell of a brutal place. Then there was the revolution in Cuba. People rightfully were trying to kick the Spanish out, who had been basically raping the country for, at that point, nearly over 300 years. Enough was enough. 400 years, actually. And when both sides were exhausted, but it looked like the local people were going to win, in came the U.S. to save the day, quote, save the day. Of course, what they really did was came in and occupied Cuba. And Cuba was occupied, and the people that managed the occupation just happened to be good old Southern gentlemen with good old racist attitudes, which they did their best to bring to Cuba. Then things sort of, muddled around. The Americans finally left, and a bunch of crooks of various kinds took over the country, the worst being a guy named Batista, and he was a horror. I mean, his way of making a political point, was to murder an opponent or someone that spoke out against him and just leave his body in the street. And he had an army of assassins and thugs and headbreakers who were at his beck and call to keep the country under control. And some people did very well under that system, most of all him. I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but it's something like he stole about $180 million from the country personally, that's known of. But again, this is way back in the 50s, so we're talking about more like $2 billion. Back when money really meant something. Now everybody can hit their card or get a loan or, whatever. Back then, everything was cash on the barrelhead. So if you had that kind of cash, you had a great deal of power. And he was so greedy that even the CIA knocked on his door and said, you got to let up a little bit here because this is just too much. But he was a thug, a criminal. I mean, just an absolute horror of a human being. And Cuba was a very miserable place. Now, if you were part of his inner circle, it wasn't so bad. If you worked for the people that were part of his inner circle, not so bad. If you were a tourist coming from the United States for a good time for a couple of days or weeks, not so bad. But if you were an average Cuban, it was a very miserable existence. If you lived in the countryside, where all the agricultural work was done, it wasn't a whole lot much better than slavery. If you lived in the countryside and were an agricultural worker, which the vast majority of people were, you didn't see a doctor ever. Your kids didn't go to school, period. You were lucky to eat. So it was a pretty miserable place. Then we've got a competition between Batista and Fidel Castro and his band. The CIA was supporting both sides. They were arming both sides. They didn't like Batista terribly much, and they were kind of happy to see him go. But they armed him anyway, just in case he won. But they absolutely armed and supported Fidel Castro and company. Now, when Castro came in, he was facing some problems. One thing, the country wasn't owned by Cubans. 60%, that's 60% of the country, the land, the industry, was owned by outsiders, largely Americans. Not limited to, but largely Americans, including people like the Bush family. You never hear about the Bush family holdings in Cuba, but they had them. And so did a lot of the other elite people in their circle. You know, the same people that supported Hitler, they were also, they also had operations in the horrific dictatorship that was existing in Cuba. So this is the country that Castro and his group inherited. It was tremendously corrupt. There was an army of really vile, murderous thugs who have been working for the government, still hanging around. The U.S. was owning, the U.S. and other outside investors owned the majority of the company. The countryside was desperately poor. Illiteracy rates sky high, infant mortality rates sky high. If you want to have a picture of how bad the countryside was in Cuba, you just have to go due east. Not that far, and you'll run into Haiti. It was similar. The situation was as bad in the countryside in Cuba as it is in Haiti today. So it's not like Castro just came along and decided, oh, I'm going to be a vicious dictator. One of the first things he did was he went out and he seized and arrested a lot of Batista's thugs, as many as he could lay hands on. And he did to them what they had been doing to the Cuban people for years. Was it rough? Was it hard? A hard way to handle the situation? Yeah, maybe. Maybe there were other things he could do. But if you suddenly had to govern a country that had tens of thousands of people who made their living breaking heads and kneecaps on behalf of the government, what do you do with those people? You know, in South Africa, they had reconciliation, or I forget what they called it. Maybe that would have been a better thing to do. But maybe they didn't have the luxury of doing that because they're just 90 miles away from the United States. And the United States was already engaged in all kinds of dirty tricks against the new government. Dirty tricks which never stopped and continued for decades. What kind of dirty tricks are we talking about? We have a video somewhere on Brass Check where an ex-CIA agent talks about his activities in Cuba. He went to Cuba posing as a Canadian. He hooked up with some of the remnants of the Batista thugs because Castro did not succeed in getting them all. And they worked together to do economic sabotage of the country. A typical project that he described was to pay off a corrupt truck driver, making a delivery of powdered milk, and taking cement and mixing the powdered milk with cement so that it was delivered to the stores and people tried to consume it, it was destroyed. It was useless. I mean, what kind of psychopath would do that? Well, the CIA did that routinely. They did everything they possibly could to undermine the Cuban government and thereby the Cuban people. Assassination attempts, even CNN, which probably is the biggest purveyor of fake news in the world, but even CNN says that Castro survived 600 assassination attempts, many of them organized by the CIA. Let's assume that that's a wild exaggeration. Let's say it's exaggerated by a factor of 10, and there were only 60 assassination attempts. Wow. I mean, how would you like it if there was one assassination attempt on you? You know, what would that do to your mind? What would it do if there were another one and another one and another one, and you knew basically that you had a target on your head at all times, and that your government and your country was being infiltrated by, just psycho mayhem creators who were intent on undermining the economy? And then we have the right-wing Cubans in Miami. And who were these people? Well, they were people who were cooperative with the American property owners, who were cooperative with Batista. I'm sure among them there were some fine, upstanding people, maybe a lot. But there definitely was a good share of psychopaths, murderous, homicidal psychopaths. There was terrorism carried out in Cuba and against Cubans by these right-wing Cubans. So when you look at Castro and some of the decisions he made and some of the things he did, you have to look at him in this context. Now let's look at what went right in Cuba. It is, amazingly, has one of the highest standards of living in the Caribbean. It shows you how low the standard of living in the Caribbean is, but still. Literacy rate is higher in Cuba than it is in the United States. Let me just repeat that. In this poor country, so economically challenged, under constant threat from the United States, they've managed to educate more people to basic literacy than the United States, with all its trillions and all its indefensible security has done. So they've done a better job on basic literacy. How about infant mortality? Infant mortality rates are higher. The number of children who die in childbirth, die young, is higher in the United States than it is in Cuba. Again, dirt poor country, severely economically challenged. They managed to put together a medical care system so that they're doing better than the so-called richest country in the world. Average life expectancy, equal. Again, poor, missing every possible resource you can imagine. And somehow they managed to equal the United States in life expectancy. They not only take care of their own as best they can given their extremely constrained circumstances, they also contribute in a positive way to the rest of the world. One of the important things Cuba did on the military front was they sent troops to Angola to fight against the South African army that was trying to invade and take over and destroy Angola. That army, by the way, and the other people in Angola working on behalf of the invading South Africans, funded by the CIA. And it was the Cuban military that made the difference, that turned the tide, that defeated that illegal invasion and sent the South Africans back. South African, a very rich country, big military, no shortage of homicidal maniacs in that country. And the Cubans, at their own expense of life and treasure, did that on behalf of what they felt was a brother country. Let's look at Cuba's medical system. Throughout the entirety of Latin America, including big, relatively well-developed countries like Mexico, people go to Cuba to get their medical degree. Why? because the medical education is superior to what they can get at home. Cuba has also taken control of its pharmaceutical industry. Think about it. Why should making drugs be a profit-making venture? It should be a scientific venture. You figure out what is it that people actually really need. You do the research based on that. You make it as inexpensively as possible, and you make it available to as many people as possible. Contrast that with our pharmaceutical industry. You scam, you lie, you cheat. You figure out what will make you the most money, whether it helps anybody or not. If it hurts people, you don't care. You just withdraw the drug after you've made your killing and go on to the next catastrophe. Which pretty much sums up the pharmaceutical industry, except for the fact they also charge through the moon, and they also have a monopoly position in the United States, which means if you dare try to buy equally as good pharmaceuticals in another country and bring them in the United States, you're committing a crime. Even if your life depends on it, even if you're not able to afford the drugs and you need them to save your life. That's the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. Compared with the pharmaceutical industry in Cuba, which is actually doing a pretty good job of developing new drugs that people actually really need. And again, at a cost that people can afford. So you're going to hear a lot of stuff about how terrible the communists in Cuba are and how repressive they are, how terrible Castro was. And I don't know, I'm certainly not here to defend him, but you have to look at the overall environment that he had to operate in. And you have to look at the results of what he did. I mean, you have to be fair-minded about it. You have to look at the good and the bad. One of the good things that I left out is Cuba routinely, when there's a disaster around the world, Cuba routinely sends its medical people en masse to go and help. Again, this is a little poor country. What does the U.S. do? Well, we know what Bill and Hillary Clinton did. Bush family was somewhat involved, but not as much as the Clintons. They used Haiti, the disaster in Haiti, the earthquake, a couple of years ago, as an opportunity to raise millions, tens of millions of dollars, which nobody can trace. Nobody can trace it to any substantial, reasonable project anywhere in Haiti. There's a luxury hotel in a city that was never involved in the earthquake. There's a garment factory in the north of Haiti that was in an area completely unaffected by the earthquake. Clinton friends are making millions from those enterprises, and I'm sure they're getting a kickback on that. But as for the actual needs of the people right after the earthquake, nothing was done. Nothing at all was done. I'm going to read a bit here from The Independent about how Haiti stepped up when its neighbor, how Cuba stepped up when its neighbor Haiti was devastated. And they've done the same thing, by the way. I don't have a contemporary article, but they've done the same thing after the most recent hurricane. But anyway, here's the article. They are the real heroes of the Haitian earthquake disaster, the human catastrophe on America's doorstep, which Barack Obama pledged a monumental humanitarian mission to alleviate. And we all know what Barack Obama's word is worth. And to go on in the article, they say, except these heroes are from America's arch enemy, Cuba, whose doctors and nurses have put U.S. efforts to shame. Little sidebar. Cuba's about the size of Florida. It's actually smaller. It has the population of Ohio, more or less. So how is it possible that this little impoverished, struggling country can put the U.S. to shame when it comes to humanitarian efforts? A medical brigade of 1,200 Cubans is operating all over earthquake-torn and cholera-infected Haiti as part of Fidel Castro's international medical mission which has won the socialist state many friends, but little international recognition. I wonder how many times you've heard about the work that Cuba does to help around the world, especially in the medical arena. Observers of the Haiti earthquake could be forgiven for thinking international agencies were alone in tackling the devastation that killed 250,000 people and left nearly 1.5 million homeless. In fact, Cuban healthcare workers have been in Haiti since 1998. So when the earthquake struck, the 350-strong team jumped into action. And amid the fanfare and publicity surrounding the arrival of help from the U.S. and the U.K., hundreds more Cuban doctors, nurses, and therapists arrived with barely a mention. Most countries were gone within a few months, again leaving the Cubans and Doctors Without Borders as the principal healthcare providers for the impoverished Caribbean islands. Figures released last week show that Cuban medical personnel working in 40 centers across Haiti have treated more than 30,000 cholera patients since October. They are the largest foreign contingent, treating around 40% of the nation's cholera patients. Another batch of medics from the Cuban Henry Reeve Brigade, a disaster and emergency specialist team, arrived recently as it became clear Haiti was struggling to cope with the epidemic that had already killed hundreds. Since 1998, Cuba has trained 550 Haitian doctors for free. And another 400 are currently being trained at the school, their main medical school, which offers free education, including free books, even spending money, to anyone sufficiently qualified who cannot afford to study medicine in their own country. John Kirk, a professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Canada, Dalhousie, I don't know how to pronounce it, Dalhousie, who researches Cuba's international medical team, said, quote, Cuba's contribution to Haiti is the world's greatest secret. They are barely mentioned, even though they are doing much of the heavy lifting. This tradition can be traced back to 1960, when Cuba sent a handful of doctors to Chile hit by a powerful earthquake, followed by a team of 50 to Algeria in 1963. This was 4 years after the revolution, which saw nearly half the country's 7,000 doctors voting with their feet and leaving for the U.S. Now, you can't blame anybody that votes with their feet and leaves for greener pastures. People need to be free to do what they want to do. But you then can't turn around and say, Castro, look at these people, they're horrible. They're nothing but horrible. Well, you know what? They inherited a really, really bad situation. They inherited a very dangerous, violent, and corrupt bigger neighbor who's done nothing but make the lives of the people of Cuba miserable. And they've done the best they can with very bad circumstances. Now, could they do better? Could there be more freedom in Cuba? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I guess. But until you've had somebody try to kill you 600 times, and you've had the world's richest nation send an army of spies into your country to try to poison and contaminate the food supply and every other aspect of the economy, until you've had your economy just ripped to shreds by being not allowed to trade with the biggest logical trade partner there would be. And by the way, it's not the U.S. government that trades with the Cuban government. It's United States companies and United States entrepreneurs that would love to trade with Cuba, that would love to buy things from Cuba and sell things to Cuba. That's been banned. Well, what's that all about? The land of the free? Really? Really? You can't go and travel to Cuba? I mean, how crazy is that? So when you hear these people throwing stones at Castro and the Cuban government, just keep all these other things in mind. They're not telling the full story. They're not telling what the country, what shape the country was in, or who was running it, or how it was being run before Castro came in. They're not talking about the dire conditions in the countryside, as bad as Haiti when Castro came in. And they're not talking about the improvements that were made to the lives of millions of people. Yeah, if you were plugged into the old regime and enjoying the old regime, maybe it was uncomfortable and you had to leave. Hey, you know, you took your chances, you bet on the wrong horse, and you lost. Tough. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. And I hope it's helpful to you to get some perspective on the real deal in Cuba.